Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming back out. We're getting more into the history now, as opposed to we've been spending several weeks in our statement of faith. We're actually getting into our history, and I'm calling this the more recent history, but looking at what I'm going to call our great-grandfathers. I'm using that terminology because the way that we think of America as having founding fathers, those guys like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, that first generation of guys that really led the country in the beginning, you can think of Antioch the same way. We had this first generation of guys that really led the church right when it got started. And so the grandfathers of the church then would be the fellas that trained those guys, and the great-grandfathers would be the fellas that trained those guys. So this may seem like a reach, but I think it's going to be helpful for us to see who trained the guys that are here. Where did they get their background and what made them the way that they are? So as we're getting started, we left off last week having gone through church history and getting to Baptists in America, leading into the 1700s. We talked about Roger Williams planting the first Baptist church in America, and the Quakers and the Baptists were forming this alliance around religious tolerance in places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Rhode Island. So today, we start out in the 1700s. By 1707, there were 5 Baptist churches in Pennsylvania, specifically in Philadelphia. Okay? So remember, the Quakers were tolerant of religious diversity, Baptists particularly, and so the only place outside of Rhode Island really that Baptists could be was in Pennsylvania. And so there in the capital of Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, there were 5 Baptist churches in 1707, and they agreed to form what's called the Philadelphia Baptist Association. It was the first Baptist association in America. Just like we have the Logan Todd Association in our local area, they had the Philadelphia Baptist Association of those 5 churches. And when they came together in the early 1700s, they wanted a statement of faith that would tell people what they believed. Now this is 1707 and forward. The Baptists in England had in 1689 published the London Baptist Confession of Faith, which told everyone what Baptists in London believed. That wasn't all that long ago. In fact, the lead minister in Philadelphia was a guy named Elias Keach. And Elias Keach was the son of Benjamin Keach, who was one of the authors of the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith. Elias actually had come to America in the hopes of making some money as a preacher. He wasn't even a Christian at the time. He just thought that he could make some money as a preacher because of his last name, because his father, Benjamin Keach, was a fairly famous preacher at the time. And it was under his own preaching, his first sermon he ever preached, that he was converted. So you imagine, the preacher starts preaching and suddenly he gets saved. And so, a very interesting story there. But when the Philadelphia Baptists wanted to write a statement of faith or confession, of course they turned to Elias Keach because his father had written the one that the Baptists in England had used. And he presents them with the 1689, this London Baptist Confession that they wrote just 30 years prior. Well, they say, we like everything in here, but there's 2 things we'd like to add. There were a bunch of Welsh Baptists who had come to Pennsylvania. One of their leaders was a guy named Morgan Edwards. They were big on laying hands. They thought that was very important. When you ordain a pastor or a deacon, or when you're praying over somebody that's sick, you need to lay hands on them. That was a big deal for them. And so they said, we want it written in the confession that we believe in laying hands. Okay, so Elias writes that down. The other thing was, hymns were becoming much more popular. You got to think, in the 1600s, I should have played this for you. And I'll start doing that now in the weeks to come. I'll have to remember that. The music from the Catholic age was not hymns. They did not ever sing hymns. They sang things like what we listened to last week, where you had the Lord's Prayer just set to music. They would just sing the scriptures. Or they would sing creeds, things like that. Early Baptists believed in what they abbreviated as EP, exclusive psalmody, which means they only sang the Psalms. Okay, so you think about the book of Psalms, 150 Psalms. They had books that looked just like our hymnals, but they were called psalters. And they were a hymn book with psalms in them. So it had Psalm 1 through 150, and they had them set to music. And they had rewritten them in English to where they would rhyme in English. And so you would sing the Bible with music. Sometimes they didn't even sing them with music. They would just sing the Psalms. But in the early 1700s, hymns were becoming much more common. You had people in the 1700s like John and Charles Wesley coming forward. Of course, they would found the Methodist Church, but those guys wrote a lot of hymns. And you had people like, who's the fellow that wrote Amazing Grace? Newton, who was a slave trader, captain of a slave ship. These people started writing hymns, and hymns became very popular. And so the early Baptists said, we want it written that we are not exclusive psalmody people. We don't only sing psalms. We want to sing hymns as well. And so they wanted those two things added. We lay hands and we sing hymns. So Elias Keach, he writes those two things down, and he ships over to London, and he goes and talks to his father, who had just 30 years earlier helped write the 1689 London Baptist Confession. Talks to him about it, and a couple of other Baptist ministers of the area, and they say, yeah, that's fine. Write those in, that's good. And so they did. They came back, and in 1707, somewhere in there, the Philadelphia Baptists started putting together what we now call the Philadelphia Baptist Confession of Faith, which is the 1689 plus laying hands and singing hymns. Why did they want a new one? Why didn't they just amend the London? In the 1700s, again, the Declaration of Independence is 1776. But in America, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, there was a mindset being fomented that there was a new identity. The people in America, although they loved being British, they also loved being American. They were beginning to formulate this identity that they were not English. They were American. And so, I don't want to get too far into this, but England is a country, Britain is a conglomeration of countries. Okay, so the people in Scotland are British. The people in Wales are British. The people in Northern Ireland are British. But the English are only from England. So the people in America, they loved being British. They liked actually being a colony of England. But they did not want to be English. They wanted to be British Americans. So that started to separate their identity. And they wanted to have their own things, an American confession. And so they get it. And in 1742, they affirmed the Philadelphia Confession of Faith. Now, this is an early copy of it. This isn't one of the first ones. This is from 1798. The first editions of this were printed by a young guy in Philadelphia named Benjamin Franklin. So, as a young man, he was one of the only printers in Philadelphia that would print the Baptist Confession of Faith. Okay? He was quite liberal for his time. Now, after the Revolutionary War 1776 to 1783, after the war, all the treaties that the British had made with the French and the Spanish and the Native Americans were suddenly off because the treaties had not been made with Americans. There was no such thing. So all the treaties that had been made were now off the table, and the American colonies were responsible for making their own treaties. One of the treaties that the British had made with the French and the Spanish and the natives was that they would not allow their colonists to go over the Appalachian Mountains. No English or British people were allowed west of the Appalachians. So everything west of North Carolina, South Carolina, that was all off limits. Well, after the war, the Americans go, well, we're not going to keep that one. That would make no sense. So all of a sudden, American colonists start flooding over the Appalachian Mountains, and along with them come frontier preachers. And so in 1791, the Baptists in Pennsylvania realized that they need to be sending not just preachers, but doctrine. They need to send books that will teach people what Baptists believe. Well, they can't send this thing because it's quite lengthy, it's expensive to print, it's too much to memorize, so they need to sum it up. And so they, in 1791, summed it up with what they called the Abstract of Principles. And that abstract is exactly what you find on the first page of Antioch's founding documents. So this Philadelphia Abstract of Principles that they sent with frontier preachers is what was the founding document of Antioch. It's what we believed when the frontier preachers got here. Where did those frontier preachers come from? This is where we're getting into the great-grandfathers. It starts with a man named Isaac Eaton. Isaac Eaton, or Elder Isaac Eaton, he was always referred to as Elder because back then that's what they called their pastors. Elder Eaton was the pastor, one of the pastors of Hopewell Baptist Church in New Jersey. Again, 3 areas where Baptists were really allowed to be: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. He's the pastor of Hopewell Baptist Church in Hopewell, New Jersey. And in 1756, he comes up with an idea. We need a college. We need a college to train Baptist pastors. Baptists in America, and in England for that matter, had up to this point really valued formal education. They thought, here's something that blows our mind today. Baptists are the only people where you can be a pastor and not have a formal education. We're the only Christians that do that. If you want to be this will tell you something. Before Storm and I came here, we were members of the Methodist Church in Richmond, Kentucky. If you want to be a deacon in a Methodist church, you have to have a master's degree in divinity. You can't even be a deacon without a master's in divinity. So other denominations, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, they all really value formal education. They want their pastors and their deacons to be trained. Baptists in the early years were no different. They really believed in formal education. The problem was we didn't have a college that was Baptist. Princeton was Presbyterian, Yale was Congregationalist, Columbia was Episcopalian, Harvard was Congregationalist. All the early colleges were of different denominations. You couldn't go get a Baptist education anywhere. There wasn't a Baptist college. It didn't exist. By the way, those colleges that are now called Ivy League schools, they were all founded as preacher schools. Every school was founded as a seminary, a pastor's college to train pastors. Harvard, to this day, their logo has the statement Veritas, which is Latin for truth, and they have a cross on there. They've changed their logo in the last 3 years because they've had to distance themselves from their Christian foundation. But these early colleges were all Christian. But the Baptists wanted a college where they could train their pastors. They were sending them to these colleges, but they're being trained by Lutherans and Episcopalians and Presbyterians. So Isaac Eaton says, we're going to start a college. It's going to be a Baptist college for our pastors. And so they called it the Hopewell Academy. And this is where it started. It was actually in the parsonage of the church, the Hopewell Academy in 1756. It was funded by the Philadelphia and Charleston associations. By 1761, they had enough money to actually start a campus outside of the parsonage. And so they got some land in Providence, Rhode Island. Again, there are only 3 places Baptists could be: Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So they get land in Providence, Rhode Island, and they start a college that ultimately today is called Brown University. It's an Ivy League school. Now the students start coming out of that, being trained in the ministry. And the students coming out of the Hopewell Academy immediately run to the frontier. They want to go start churches in the American frontier. And 2 of those early graduates of the Hopewell Academy that came to the American frontier were John Gannot and John Sutton. So we're going to talk about them for a little bit because they end up being the great-grandfathers of Antioch. John Sutton is the first one. He was a descendant of Puritans, so you can remember up the line, we talked about how that the Puritans influenced Baptists. The descendant of Puritans, he was born the 12th of February, 1733, in Somerset, New Jersey. Again, only place a Baptist could be. His father died in 1740 when he was 7 years old. And if you go back on the records, his mother refused to become the owner of the estate. She actually wrote down that the estate would be given to John Sutton, her elder son. So at 7 years old, he inherits an estate. And he is now the owner of it and the person who's responsible for doing all the business of it. So he's forced to grow up really early. And by his adulthood, he had spent much of his life traveling. He traveled in Virginia and Ohio, traveled in what would later become Tennessee and Kentucky. He had 3 younger brothers who were all Baptist preachers also. His mother had raised, you think he's one of the oldest sons, and he has 3 brothers who were all Baptist preachers. So what an influence that mother made. But he has 3 brothers who are all Baptist preachers. They all go into the frontier as well. They're all out preaching in the frontier, planting and organizing churches. At the same time as his other brother David, in 1758, he's baptized and licensed in the same year. 3 years later, in 1761, he's ordained, and they send him to Nova Scotia, Canada, to be a missionary. And he stayed in Nova Scotia for 6 years, pastoring there. So I want to touch on this because this is a part of our history. Have any of you ever been present for the licensure of a pastor? Not an ordination, but the licensure. Yeah, this is a neat one. So historically, Baptists have had several steps to becoming a pastor. We don't usually follow them anymore, but historically there's been several steps. The pastor would recognize you as what they used to call a gifted brethren. That was actually a title. He's been identified as a gifted brethren. And so they would say he seems to have a gift for understanding and teaching the Bible, and so he's a gifted brother. And after the church identified that, you would preach in your home church for a season, and the church would either say, yes, we believe he's called to preach, or they would say, no, we don't believe that's what he's called to. There might be something else, but preaching's not it. If the church affirmed your calling and said, we believe he's called to preach, they would give you a license. And the license was essentially a statement that said, this church affirms that you are called to preach, and we give you the permission to go out and preach in other churches. Okay, so you would be licensed to preach in your church and other churches. And then as you preached in other churches, at some point a church would recognize that they believed you were called to preach, and they might call you to the pastorate. And when a church called you to be their pastor, then that church and your church would come together to ordain you, and you would be ordained. So only a man who was a pastor would be ordained, but many preachers would be licensed. Okay? That comes up because early in Antioch's history, we license a man of color. This is long before the Civil War, 50 years before the Civil War, that we were licensing a black man to preach. That's a huge deal. This is before there was such a thing as black and white churches. There was no black churches. All churches were integrated back then. So to license a black man to preach in the early 1800s was a big deal, because you were saying, we think you are called to preach, and we believe you should not only preach here, but go preach at other churches, preach to other white people in the slave era. Okay, that was a major deal. And if you were a man of God that was licensed to preach and you came under church discipline, instead of excommunicating you from the church, they would take your license away. And they would say, we don't believe that you're called to preach. And if you can right yourself, then you might be able to get your license back. But right now, we don't authorize you to preach anywhere. Big, crazy difference from the way we do it today. But John Sutton is licensed and baptized and ultimately ordained in Scotch Plains Regular Baptist Church, New Jersey. He goes to Nova Scotia as a missionary, serves there for several years, comes back for the War of Independence, served as a soldier in the Patriot Army in the Virginia Continental Line. After the war, he receives a land grant for land in what is now called Kentucky. He came to Kentucky in 1790, and he lived on the banks of the Dix River. So I've got this red dot here where he lived, and this one is Antioch, so you can kind of see how far he ended up coming, even in Kentucky. And you got to understand, the distances that we drive today What you'll drive in a single day is farther than people traveled in their lifetime back then. We'll make a drive to Owensboro or make a drive to Lexington in a day for, if we've got a reason. Back then, to travel from Lexington up here to western Kentucky where we are, your whole lifetime you wouldn't go that far. Your children might make that distance. And, if you wanted to make the trip from here to there, you would do it in the spring so that you'd make sure you got there before the winter. And you'd expect grandma to die before you got there. I mean, it was like traveling was just insanely difficult. So he's traveled this far by the time he gets to influencing Antioch. He's on the Dix River there, and he plants a church called the Forks of Dix River Baptist Church, which still exists. This is an image of it there. It's still there. He plants that church, an early member of it. His son served in the War of 1812. And so this kind of gets us into some of the distinctives of early ancestors of Antioch, things that we know about them for sure. First of all, John Sutton, if we know anything about that man, he was an abolitionist. And what I mean by that is he was against slavery. There is almost nothing that can be more widely attested about him than that he was an abolitionist. He hated slavery. In the 1790s, especially in Kentucky, that was not common. Kentucky was a slave state. Civil War, we were neutral, but Kentucky was a slave state. In the 1790s, Baptists in Kentucky were very uncomfortable with the idea of speaking out against slavery. The associations had actually started having to discuss this, and what they came out with was disappointing. So, for example, in 1790, the Salem Association was presented with a question by some of its members. The question was, is it lawful in the sight of God for a member of Christ's church to keep his fellow creature in perpetual slavery? That's the question. The answer: the association judges it improper to enter into so important and critical a matter at present. They say, something that important, something that critical, we're not talking about that. Which is so backwards. That's really, really important, so we're not going to discuss it. What a ridiculous answer. Just a couple of years later, 1805, the Elkhorn Association. This is closer to us. This is north of us, up near Greenville. Okay? The Elkhorn Association issues this statement. This association judges it improper, and catch this, it is improper for ministers, churches, or associations to meddle with emancipation from slavery or any other political subject. And as such, we advise ministers and churches to have nothing to do therewith in their religious capacities. It's improper for pastors and churches to talk about slavery or any other political issue. That's inappropriate. That's where they were. Now, it was after this meeting in 1805, John Sutton was there. He was present for that. After that meeting, he and his church withdrew from the Elkhorn Association. And they actually renamed themselves. They came together and formed a new name for their church. The name of the church was New Hope Church of Emancipation Baptist. That's a statement. That when you put it in the name, we are Emancipation Baptist. We do not believe in slavery. It was the first emancipation church in Kentucky. Now, Sutton was an effective communicator, very effective preacher, and he won several men, lots of pastors, over to abolitionism. One of those guys was a guy named Carter Tarrant. Carter Tarrant was the pastor of Bannister Baptist Church in Virginia. It was the largest church in Virginia. By the way, Virginia, again, another slave state. He is the pastor of the largest church in a slave state. And he comes under the influence of John Sutton. And suddenly, he's an abolitionist and a pretty big one. And he leaves his church in Virginia and moves to Logan County. He's one of the first settlers of Logan County. He's the first Baptist pastor ever in Logan County. And he's a headstrong abolitionist because he was under the influence of John Sutton. He began pastoring a church with John Sutton. He eventually wrote a book called The History of Emancipationists in Kentucky. His biographer wrote of him, this is of Tarrant, More than any other Baptist in early Kentucky history, Tarrant was for the emancipation of human slavery. More than anybody else. So he won them to this, not just a little bit, but to the point where he was more emancipationist than anybody. That's what John Sutton was doing. And so Tarrant ends up dying. He served as a chaplain in the War of 1812. He died in the war. But John Sutton was a headstrong abolitionist. He was against slavery. And that's a distinctive of Antioch. Our founders were abolitionists. That will come up in our history as we move through these early to mid 1800s. We were abolitionists. This church hated slavery, which didn't go well for a lot of seasons in our time. The second distinctive, well, let me stop there for a second, just see if there's any questions on any of that. Amen. We like it. Okay, good. Yeah. Kentucky was a hotbed. When I did my bachelor's, my bachelor's thesis was on why Protestant churches changed their opinion on abolitionism between, call it 1609 and 1865. Because early in American history, all Protestant denominations were against slavery. And by the time you get to the early 1800s, late 1700s, all of them have just shut up about it. And so I wrote on that, and Kentucky's a hotbed for that. It's a longer discussion I'd be glad to have. But as far as Antioch goes, this church was abolitionist, adamantly against slavery. The second thing, this shouldn't come as any surprise given what I just talked about, our ancestry, and we've talked about our statement of faith. The early ancestors of Antioch were Calvinists. That was a distinctive. They were Calvinists. John Sutton, he trained under Calvinists at the Philadelphia Hopewell Academy. Every church he ever planted, I've looked at their founding documents and what they believed. They were all Calvinists. Every church he ever pastored was Calvinist. Every church influenced by people he influenced was Calvinist. So the people of Antioch's ancestry were thoroughly Calvinist. The next thing, though, the third distinctive, was that they were committed to expositional preaching. This is written of John Sutton. It says, he was a man of considerable distinction in his day, and in rich expositions from the Scriptures, he had but few equals. Now that word expositions, this is a quote, in rich expositions, that's not just a word that's used, that's a type of preaching. Okay? So there's really two types of preaching. There's expositional preaching and topical preaching. For most of your lives, you've probably heard topical preaching. Topical preaching is where the pastor has an idea or a thought that he wants to convey, and so he goes in the Bible and looks for a passage where he can explain that idea and then preaches from there. Expositional preaching is where the pastor says, we're going to be preaching through Genesis, and we're going to go verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book, and whatever the passage says, that's going to be the point of the sermon this week. So if the sermon is on tithing, that's on tithing. And next week we might be talking about adultery, and next week we might be talking about the covenant with Abraham. But as we're going through, whatever the text says, that's the point of the sermon. The point of the text is the point of the sermon. All right? Evidently, the ancestors of Antioch were committed to expositional preaching. Topical preaching came a little later, but expositional preaching seems to be the method of the early ancestors. The fourth thing that's a distinctive here is that they were committed to evangelical activity. It's written of John Sutton. He was exceedingly active and energetic in his holy calling. This is also here. I don't have this written on the screen. It says, and he doubtlessly accomplished much good in the early part of his ministry. These were not hyper-Calvinist. They did not believe that we shouldn't be sharing the gospel because God has an elect and he's just going to save whoever he wants and that's the end of it. They believed in the free proclamation of the gospel. We preach to people with the intention of them being saved. We prepare people's hearts to receive the Lord. They were evangelistic. They were intentionally evangelistic. Now that's a lot about John Sutton, but how does he relate to Antioch? Well, first of all, some of his biological grandchildren were founding members of Mount Pleasant in Lewisburg. Mount Pleasant and Antioch share a great deal of history. I mentioned to you weeks ago that pastors back then didn't just pastor one church at a time. They pastored multiple churches on a circuit. Well, the pastors of Antioch, the three founding presbyters, just so happened to also be the founding pastors of Mount Pleasant. And they were founded, I think, 3 or 5 years after us. The same people were there. And so these people that influenced Mount Pleasant largely were the same people that influenced Antioch. And so the fact that his grandchildren, and by the way, he still has descendants that attend Mount Pleasant. They're still there. His people are still here. But his grandchildren were there for the founding Mount Pleasant. But more directly, he trained several of the men that would become the pastors of Antioch. For example, he trained a guy named David Barrow. Elder David Barrow was a major abolitionist in Kentucky in those early years. Huge figure. David Barrow was converted in 1770. His family was slave owning. In 1784, he freed his slaves. He even reached out to Thomas Jefferson. We have the letters in the Library of Congress, in the archive there in Washington. We have the letters from David Barrow to Thomas Jefferson where he was pleading for Thomas Jefferson to end slavery in Virginia. Okay, he's an adamant abolitionist. He petitioned Congress in 1815 to allocate land for freed slaves, which was a wild idea. He was also an avid Calvinist, very much a Calvinist. He even went out of his way to try to convince General Baptists to become Calvinist and had a lot of success at it. He called it the Orthodox plan. He said, if you're not Calvinist, you're not even Orthodox. You're not even a Christian if you're not Calvinist. So he was more Calvinist than me, to put it that way. So he was very much in line with these early Antioch ancestors. But the connection with Antioch through him lies with his nephew. David Barrow had a nephew named Isaac Barrow. It's his sister's son. Isaac Barrow, or no, that's wrong. It was his brother's son. My mistake there. I just saved some time from next week. I won't have to have a whole slide about corrections. It's his brother's son. So Isaac Barrow was his nephew. He would be voted in as pastor of Antioch during the Civil War. Funny story about what happened during the Civil War at Antioch. We had a pastor named James Lamb. He's buried in the cemetery there in Russellville, right across the street from Papa John's. James Lamb and the church during the Civil War, what's written in the minutes is it says there was a difference of opinion in regards to the war between the states. Now, they don't detail who was on what side. But I've gone into the records at the Logan County Archive. James Lamb's son enlisted in the Confederate Army the week after he was dismissed. Then, the very next pastor that they vote in here at Antioch is Isaac Barrow, who was an abolitionist. So James Lamb's son enlists with the Confederacy, and Antioch votes in an abolitionist. So I believe that it's fair to say the difference of opinion between the war between the states was that Antioch was for the North, and their pastor was for the South. And so they had to vote out their pastor over it. And they vote in Isaac Barrow, who's the nephew of David Barrow, who trained under John Sutton. Okay, so we're getting to there. Isaac was also a big part of Center Church in between Lewisburg and Russellville that planted Antioch, but we'll get there another time. Another direct connection between John Sutton and Antioch is this guy, William Hickman. We'll talk a lot about him next week. William Hickman was another avid abolitionist and church planter in Kentucky. Hickman was a wildly successful pioneer preacher. This guy, we wouldn't think about it in our time. He pastored a church called the Forks of Elkhorn in Franklin County. 1788, they had 100 members. That was massive. A 100-person church in 1788 in Kentucky. This is like he was the Joel Osteen of his day. He had, he just crazy 100 people in one church. But in 1805, let me go back here and show you this. So in 1805, when the Elkhorn Association publishes this statement saying, we don't want ministers or churches talking about slavery, that meeting was held at his church. That was at William Hickman's church. And so he was set to preach following the business meeting. Well, he preached a sermon, and his text was Isaiah 58:6, which if you don't know that by heart, the verse says, Is this not the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke? So the association says pastors shouldn't talk about freeing slaves anymore. And he stands up and preaches a whole sermon on freeing slaves. And in fact, he's quoted as saying, all slaveholders in this church are hereby disfellowshipped. And if you are not going to disfellowship slaveholders from the membership of this church, I will resign immediately. He says that in front of the whole association that just said, we're not going to talk about it. So he ends up resigning. That's how that went. He resigns on the spot. The next week, they actually double back and ask him to come back and be their pastor again. Crazy story there. But it was at that church, the Forks of Elkhorn Baptist Church, that he preached to and saw converted and baptized and ended up recognizing a gift in a man named Philip Warden. This was in 1813. 2 months after moving to Stony Point Church, which is in Logan County, was at the time, Warden was recognized as having a gift. He was identified as a gifted brethren. And so they started allowing him to preach from time to time, recognized the gift, the church affirmed the gift, they licensed him to preach. The quote, they licensed him to preach at home and abroad. 2 years later, in 1815, they ordained him to the pastorate. And 3 years after that, in 1818, he was sent to be one of the 3 men to serve as the pastors of Antioch. So Philip Warden is one of the founding pastors, the original presbytery here at Antioch in 1818. He's converted, baptized, licensed, and ordained under William Hickman. William Hickman was trained by John Sutton. Okay, so we're really getting into our people now. The other guy that came out of the Hopewell Academy, again, going all the way back to Philadelphia, New Jersey, again, Hopewell Academy sends these guys out. John Sutton was one of them. The other guy was John Gannot. John Gannot was born 22nd of July, 1727. His father was a Presbyterian. His mother was a Baptist, which made for some interesting beliefs. His father was a descendant of Huguenots, which if you know anything about French history, the Huguenots were largely massacred in France by the Catholics. They were Calvinists in France. The Catholics didn't want them there. They fled to America, and what do you know? There were a bunch of Spanish people here, and if you know anything about the Spanish, they're also Catholic. And so they also were massacred here. So the Huguenots had gone through a lot of trouble to be Presbyterians, and John Gannot's father wasn't going to have his son become a Baptist, even though his mother was Baptist. So he raised him Presbyterian, and when he came of age, he sent him to school at Princeton, which was a Presbyterian college, to be tutored by a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, without a doubt, there is no argument, Jonathan Edwards is the best pastor to ever come out of America. The best preacher ever. He was the reason we had such a thing as the First Great Awakening. You can make a very good argument. He's the reason the Founding Fathers declared independence. They were listening to his sermons. He was a major figure. Preached a sermon you've probably heard of, The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That was Jonathan Edwards. I've never been able to read that sermon in one sitting. It just levels you. But Jonathan Edwards tutors John Gannot. He graduates from Princeton and goes on to study at the Hopewell Academy. 1754, he's ordained at Scotch Plains Baptist Church. Where have we heard that before? It's the church that John Sutton was ordained at. He was there 7 years earlier, ordained at the same church, sent out from the same church. He later became a trustee of the Hopewell Academy. When the Revolutionary War came, he served as a chaplain in the Patriot Army. When he comes to Kentucky after the war, it's written that he was the most respected Baptist pastor of the frontier era. Everyone understood that John Gannot was the man. He was the Baptist pastor. He was said to have been, this is a quote, the most learned and distinguished of all pioneer preachers in Kentucky. He had the most matured wisdom, the longest and most varied experience, and he had such eminent piety and consecration that it made him of incalculable benefit to the cause of the blessed Redeemer in this new country. He was the most respected pastor west of the Appalachians. This man was a major, major figure. His education and his recognizable preaching ability was such that it really could be argued that Kentucky Baptists gleaned much of everything they believed from either his pen or his pulpit. He was such a major figure of the era. His testimony is really cool. I want to read you this. He says, "One day while plowing in a field, suddenly the passage came to mind. 'Warn the people, or their blood I will require at your hands.' The passage weighed on me with such weight in my mind that I worked until 11 o'clock at night entirely in a daze. When I finally came to, I found that I was wet with rain, although I did not remember it ever raining. My horses were excessively fatigued to the point of death, and the labor that I had performed was astonishing." He went into a trance. He had a single verse come to his mind, and for several hours until 11 o'clock at night, plowed a field to the point where his horses were worn out. It just blew him away. After that, he continued to serve as a pastor. Like I said, he was a chaplain during the Revolutionary War. And really, this brings us to another distinctive of Antioch's ancestors. Antioch's ancestors were all patriots. They were all lovers of America. Okay, they were adamant for that. John Sutton was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. John Gannot was a chaplain in the Revolutionary War. Carter Tarrant, who was trained by John Sutton, was a chaplain in the War of 1812. When you read the early documents, many of our early founders had been soldiers in the War of 1812, which was only 6 years old at that point. And their sons had also been soldiers in the War of 1812. So many of the guys in our church, those founding generations, were patriots. Elder Gannot, for his service in the Clinton, New York Brigade, was granted 200 acres for his service after the war, 200 acres in what is now Kentucky. But what's really noteworthy about him is that during the war, George Washington approached him to have a conversation about religion. This is the quote. They have the written conversation that George Washington had with John Gannot. Washington was said to have approached Gannot. He said to me, "I've been investigating the scriptures, and I believe immersion to be the baptism taught by the word of God, and I demand it at your hands." Okay. He goes on, "I do not wish for there to be any parade. I do not want the army called out. I want this to be a spectacle." Now here's the funny part. It goes on. Chaplain Gannot then took George Washington, catch this, cut the ice of the river so they could go in, and then baptized the commander-in-chief by immersion in the Potomac River in the presence of 42 witnesses. The river was frozen. They had to cut the ice so that they could get him in, and then baptized him. John Gannot was a major, major figure. To this day, he's known as George Washington's pastor. When Arianism rose in popularity, when the Unitarian churches in Kentucky cropped up, they called John Gannot. In 1803, he was called to preach a sermon series on the deity of Christ. And it's attributed with checking the spread of Arianism in the whole state. He stopped it with one sermon series on the deity of Christ. So many people trusted him and listened to him and heard him and read his sermons that when he preached that Christ was God, that ended the debate. He was that important. When he died, I'll read you his eulogy. It says, "The late Reverend John Gannot will be long remembered with affection and respect in the United States of America. He was a person below the average stature." That means he was short. They wrote that in his eulogy. He was a person below average stature, and when young, of slender form. He was skinny. But he was of firm and vigorous constitution. His mind was formed for social discourse and friendship. His passions were strong, and his sensibilities could be easily excited, but he was so chastened and regulated by the meekness of wisdom that he preserved such great composure of spirit and maintained great command of his words and actions. As a minister of Christ, he shined like a star of the first magnitude in the American churches. He moved in a widely extended field of action. And for this office, God endowed him with a large portion of grace and excellent gifts. He believed, and he spoke what he believed. His doctrines were those contained in the Baptist Philadelphia Confession of Faith. He was commonly called a Calvinist. But like John, the harbinger of our Redeemer, he was a burning and shining